So welcome to this Responsible Leadership Seminar here with Antony Jenkins. So we welcome Antony back to Oxford. He read PPE at UNIF, left the university, joined banking at Barclays, rose through Barclays, then went to Citi, ran the card business at Citi, came back to the UK, ran the card business for Barclays, became the head of retail for Barclays, became the CEO of Barclays, where he was until last year. So if I had done this seminar last year, you would have accused me of currying favor. At that point, Antony was the CEO of Barclays. Barclays is an important institution, and to be full disclosure, fund some of the research here at the school. You can be assured that I asked Antony not because he's the CEO of Barclays, because he's not anymore, but because I think he's a remarkable individual that has tremendous insights on leadership, that represents a role model about responsibility, and also has interesting insights into the world of financial services. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Antony here tonight. So here's how it's going to work. We're going to have a little conversation here for the next little bit. I'll be asking a bunch of questions. And your job is to think of the questions that you'd like to ask. About halfway through this, we'll open it up for your questions. And we'll go for about an hour, a little bit more. After that, we'll retire to the main reception area for drinks, and you can individually ask Antony some questions. Okay? So you think of your questions, but be focused on his answers first, and don't answer the same ones. Great. So, Antony, you left Oxford a few years ago and joined banking and made a decision to go into business. So, a little bit of the story. Why business? When did you make that decision? When is it that you said, I think I want to do business?
Well, firstly, let me say it's a real pleasure to be back here in Oxford, although every time I come back here, it reminds me of all of those late nights when I was a little behind on doing my essays and studying for exams, which is still a recurrent nightmare of mine. So it's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be with you all. I grew up in I grew up in a fairly ordinary family. My father always worked in manufacturing, and there were four of us, and there were only 5 years between a lot of us. So on the weekend, sometimes my father would take me into the office, I think, to get us out of the house as much as anything else. And so I used to spend a bit of time around factories in Manchester and then in places like Stoke-on-Trent. And I was always fascinated by business, and then as I grew up a bit, I became interested in politics and economics and how the world works. So it's always been a fascination with those sorts of forces that has intrigued me. And the reason why I liked banking in particular was because not only was it a big business in its own right, but many of your customers were also businesses of different sizes, so you got to see them up close and personal. So that was really what got me into the business world.
And kept you in the business world. I assume at various points along the way that you could have done other things, but continued to hold your interest over this many, many decades. Well,
I think that's right. I mean, I never really thought about doing anything else because I was enjoying what I was doing and felt like I was making a difference on some level, and other opportunities came along and they were fascinating, and I sort of just kept going. Okay. Perhaps in a failure of imagination, but nonetheless, I was enjoying what I was doing, and that's always important.
So you started at Barclays. You were kind of, like some of the students will be, in one of your first jobs. When was the first point where you said, I have to take a leadership role? When did you first think, wow, I have to lead something other than I have to do something that someone's asked me to do? And how was that for you?
Yeah, in those days, I'm going to sound ancient now when I say this, but things were quite different. So training programs were quite structured for graduates, people coming off undergrad programs, and in those days, everybody at Barclays had to go and work in a branch. So I started working in a branch, newly minted Oxford graduate, ready to change the world. And so I was given the desk, and somebody plonked this stack of continuously printed duplicate statements on the desk and said, separate those and then file them alphabetically. And do that for about 3 months, and then we might let you do something a bit more interesting. So it wasn't on day one, let's put it that way.
Fair.
It was quite a gradual build. But I suppose probably a couple of years in, you started to manage small groups of people. But I always thought that leadership is not just about how many people who report to you. It's about how you think, how you act, how you behave. And in any given situation, are you trying to make things better? Are you trying to have an impact? Are you trying to do the right thing? And are you willing to go the extra mile to achieve that? So in a branch context, for example, I was obviously quite new. I didn't really know what the hell I was doing. But customers would come in and you try and help them. And again, dating myself, there was just this 300-page book of products and services provided by the bank. And so if I had a customer question, I used to go and look it up. And it would have been easy to just say, I'm sorry, I'm new, I don't really know, I'll go and get somebody to help you. But I think in a way, leadership is above all else about taking responsibility. I also think that once you get beyond about a team of about, 10 or 20, the sort of number you can get comfortably in a conference room, the challenge changes, right? And it becomes much more about how you can use the people that you work with as the kind of distributors of the leadership impact that you're trying to have. And I ended up running an organization with 140,000 people in it in 60 countries. I was meeting with somebody last night, and they said to me, they didn't really know kind of what I did, and I said, well, I used to run Barclays. And he said, what was that like? And I said, well, you had 140,000 people in 60 countries. And he just said, wow, how did you do that? And it made me think, well, I don't know, how did I do that? It was kind of a good question.
Actually, that's a great question.
It is a great question. And so there's sort of the synapses, if you like, within the organization that you need to have firing simultaneously is really, really important. And one of my core beliefs about leadership is, firstly, it's a learned skill. So like most things in life, some people are innately better at it than others, but all of us can get better at it. It is not to be confused with examples of great leadership. So none of us will probably ever have the leadership qualities of a Nelson Mandela or a Martin Luther King, or pick any leader, but we can all be better leaders, and we could all be great leaders in the context in which we have to operate if we work at being better leaders, if we develop that as a learned skill. And I also think that leadership is very situationally specific, something that you learn the hard way. So in some circumstances where things are going along well and you're trying to solve problems creatively, you can have a much more collaborative style of leadership. If your house is on fire, I don't suggest you form a committee to figure out what the hell we do about it, right? If the house is on fire, somebody's got to say, get out, and get out fast. And so that's a much more directive type of leadership and is more applicable in crisis situations. Whereas the more collaborative style tends to work better when you're trying to solve complex problems. So I'm a big believer in leadership and the power of leadership, but I'm also a big believer in culture, which I regard as the sort of transmission mechanism into the organization. And the reason why these things are important are not because they're sort of an academically interesting topic, and not because it's sort of fluffy, and this isn't about being nice to people, right? This is about delivering organizational performance. And high quality leadership should create the culture that then empowers delivery of high performance. And it is often misunderstood that leadership is a sort of nice to have or an optional extra, or culture is something that we'll get to when we've got a spare moment. All organizations, including this one, have leadership, have culture, and have performance. And the things are intimately connected. And you can either choose to manage them and try and improve the level of performance of the organization, or you can just say it's all a bit too difficult and we won't bother.
So in the answer to that question, you mentioned that leadership is a learned skill. So how did you learn it? Or if you'd rather turn the question around, when you were managing groups of 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, how did you teach it? So, folks out here are, mostly young people, have a long career ahead of them. they're going to both have to learn how to be leaders and teach others how to be leaders. So if you think about some time that you've been taught how to be a better leader over the course of your career, maybe younger, and then when you've turned around and returned the favor and helped somebody else become a better leader, what might be some examples?
Yeah, so I think observation is really important. You can learn a lot by watching other leaders in action. And in corporations, that's often, your boss, your boss's boss. What do you think he or she does really well? What does he or she do badly? You learn, of course, best through experience. And I learned the situationally specific point myself. I learned it really the hard way when I took on my first big general management job. And we transitioned from that creative problem solving to the house is on fire, but I hadn't quite realized it. So I was actually trying to form a committee to put the fire out, and that wasn't really working for me. So, those sort of painful learnings, the things in life where we all learn most through our experiences, are really critical.
Can you tell that story a little bit? So this was when you were at Citi. This is
yeah,
early
this is
in Barclays.
when I was at Citi. I mean, this was I'd come up, through the ranks in the way that you normally do. You get to manage small P&Ls, and then somebody goes and says, you should go and be the chief of staff for this senior executive, so that you can see what it's like to run a very large organisation. So you go and do that, and of course you hopefully do a good job at it. And then somebody says, okay, now it's time for you to go run a big business. And I took on this business. The business was doing okay, actually, and the first few months were great. But then we started to hit some real problems. The economy wasn't great. Companies were cutting back on their expenditure on banking services and so on. And I suddenly realized it's a bit like, if any of you are skiers, how many people here are skiers? It's a bit like, in European terms, it's a bit like you used to blue runs and suddenly you take a turn and you're on a black run and you think, what am I going to do now? And of course, like all those situations, in the skiing analogy, when you become tense, it's hard to make the right response. And so for a while, it wasn't going so well. And I knew this because we did surveys periodically about how does the team feel about how you're doing. A few months earlier, I'd had a very positive survey. And then we hit this rocky patch, and the survey wasn't so good. And the thing you do then is you've got two choices. You can be in denial and say, okay, this is just they don't understand me, right? Or they don't appreciate the wonderful value I'm doing as a leader. Or you can say, look, this is real. This is genuine feedback. It's painful. It hurts, but I'm going to do something about it. And again, the best examples of leadership are when you can create that inflection point in your own behavior, which says, okay, what do I need to do differently? And some of this was about I needed to be more directive, and some of it was about communication. Now, every survey in your professional careers, every survey you ever do will tell you that the people that work for you want more communication. I guarantee it will happen to you all the time. But there are points in time when you really have to dial up and over-communicate. And it brings me to a very difficult circumstance that I found myself in 2012, which was when the scandal around LIBOR and Barclays broke. Now, this was a very closely held discussion, and I remember, and so I wasn't really aware of the content and the issues of it until I was talking to somebody on the day it was going to be announced. And it was just, as they articulated what was going to be announced, I could feel my sort of heart sinking because I knew it was going to be very profound. And it devastated the organization because the reputational impact was huge, but people inside felt a loss of confidence in the organization, a loss of connection to the organization. And then, of course, thinking back to my earlier experiences, I realized it was necessary to over-communicate. So I remember going round the building in Churchill Place. We've got 5,000 people in that building. I'd go floor by floor. I'd stand on a chair, I'd get 150 people together, and I'd just say, look, this feels terrible, but we'll get through it. And sometimes you just have to do that. So a long answer to your question about how do you develop and grow as a leader, you learn from your experiences and then you try and apply them and get better. But like everything in life, if you want to be a better skier or a better golfer or a better runner or a better chess player, you do have to practice. And you do have to always ask yourself, what can I improve and how do I develop?
And one of the things I'm so impressed with you, Anthony, is that you are a learning, as a leader, you're a continuously learning leader. Your CEO tenure was brought to an abrupt end, and if I may give my own personal opinion, in a dumb way, by Barclays. I'm not going to ask you to talk about that, but what have you learned from that experience? Or maybe you're still digesting it, but you are very thoughtful about the experiences you've had, so obviously, whatever you feel comfortable. But what are the lessons that maybe this group might take out of that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really possible for me to talk about the precise circumstances
nor
around
am I
it.
asking you to.
But I think this comes back to the notion of change and how do you sustain change in large organizations. And off the back of the very significant problems we had in 2012, the great thing about that, as somebody famously said, never waste a good crisis, you had a certain amount of runway to make change. So I took over in the summer of 2012. In early 2013, we implemented what was a very comprehensive and radical for the financial services industry program of culture change. And I was able to do that only because really the conditions were set by the problems that we had. And I think the problem with change is that in this world that we live in, which is incredibly fluid, very dynamic, and highly unpredictable, organizations need to continuously change. But it's hard, and when the people feel that the pressure comes off a little bit, it's hard to maintain that same imperative around change. And the other thing and I've talked about this this afternoon, the other thing that struck me coming out of my experiences in leading Barclays was that we tend to think of things like leadership and culture change and values and purpose as a very macro concept. We think about it as an organizational concept, and we think about organizations as entities. But in fact, all organizations are the aggregation of the individuals within them. And it's something I've been thinking about, we were talking about it earlier, that I just think we've missed a whole piece here where we really have to understand how people react on an individual level to these sorts of issues. The exogenous issues that are bearing down on the organization, the internal conditions within the organization, and their own hopes and fears and aspirations and so on. And the danger when you are in a very volatile and uncertain world is that people tend to tense up, and you get this sort of fear inside people, this hesitation to act, which of course is exactly the reverse of what you want. In a very volatile and fluid situation, you need people to constantly be acting and changing. And so one of the things that I think we were talking about it as a possible research, and I hope you do some research around this because I think it's really important. How do we tie together what is essentially a individual theory around this with a more macro theory around leadership, culture change, and so on? And that, I think, is one of the things which I really, reflecting on my experiences of Barclays, I came away and it only really struck me a few weeks ago. I thought, how did I miss that? But it's a big piece of learning.
So that link between the individual and the organization, you have been one of the more vocal proponents, or at least leaders, in having people think about not just effective leadership, but responsible leadership. Last year at Davos, we had a panel, and Antony was on the panel talking about responsible leadership at Barclays. You chair business in the community. You've spoken about this to One Young World. So at the level of an organization, what does it mean to be responsible?
Well, when I was in business school, we spent a bit of time looking at this topic, and there were two positions articulated. One was the sort of Milton Friedman position of, the business of business is business. If business makes profit, they'll be able to employ people, pay taxes, and that's where its responsibility stops. And that was contrasted with, I think in this case, the approach of Marks and Spencer's, which was a much more holistic view of the purpose of business and the responsibilities of business. And for me, this second way of viewing the world was much more appealing. Not necessarily on an ethical level, although there are attractions on an ethical level, but really on a practical level, because it seemed to me to be just a gross simplification to say that all businesses had to do was make profit. And the reason for this, of course, is that the activities of any business are closely connected. I'm sure in the things that you study here, you'll look at high-performing organizations that have very high levels of customer satisfaction and engagement. That is closely correlated to high levels of colleague engagement. And by the way, organizations with high levels of customer and colleague engagement tend to be more profitable and tend to deliver higher returns and tend to have a better relationship with society. Business only exists at the pleasure of society, not the other way round. And it's a depressing fact, but there are still many business leaders who believe that the role of society is simply to create the conditions in which they can make a lot of money. That is not how it works. So if an organization is thinking about how do I deliver for my customer in the short and the long term, how do I do that through creating high levels of colleague engagement, how do I deliver superior returns for the providers of capital, and what is my role as a business in society? How can I, and I'm very taken by the concept of externality in this context, right? So what the externalities around business, are they positive, negative, or neutral? How do we create less negative externality? How do we create more positive externality as a business? And through the activities that we undertake as a business. This is not about corporate social responsibility, which ultimately I think is a sort of, it's not a bad concept, but it's an inadequate concept. It can have the tendency of being, I'll pay for a get out of jail free card because I'm going to sponsor some primary schools or something. This is not that. This is about we as a business have an impact in the world. Let's understand that impact. Let's ensure it's positive wherever possible. It won't always be possible. But wherever possible, let's ensure that it is. And this is where issues like tax come into play. It's very complex to harmonize the interests of society, which would like corporations to pay more tax, with the interests of shareholders, where within the confines and spirit of the law, all other things being equal, shareholders would prefer less tax to be paid. How do you strike the balance between those interests? But it's also about harnessing the capabilities of the organization to solve social problems. And one of the things that I was most proud about was at Barclays, we created over 2,000 apprenticeships aimed at people in the NEET population, not in education, employment, and training. And we employed a lot of people every year through branch networks and call centers and stuff. And we had to sort of tilt our employment mechanisms to help these people become employed. But what we found, although we had to spend money to do that, what we found was that the people who graduated this program were among some of our best, highest performing colleagues, because actually we'd given them a shot when nobody else would. And so there was a self-interest element to this. And what I believe in aggregate is, if you look at the short and the long term, businesses should endeavor to optimize the benefits for all of their stakeholders over the short and the long term. Clearly, there are a number of trade-offs that have to be made. Sometimes those are very difficult trade-offs, but they have to be made. And finally, the reason why this is really important is because if you're doing all of that, you have to have an inherently more capable organization. You just have to, because you're solving a more complex equation. And so if you have a more capable organization, you're likely to have a higher performing organization. But of course, building this type of organization requires a sort of very methodical, disciplined, and consistent approach. And that is hard to do in this kind of world of short-termism. But that's where my belief in responsible business is responsible business is good business. It's good business for shareholders as much as anybody else.
So let's follow up on that for a moment. So the model that you have is there's an inexorable logic that says this enlightened kind of business will perform better, right? Because you have better, more satisfied customers, happier, more motivated employees, and all the other benefits that you've just laid out. At the same time, rolled the clock back a year and a week, I think, when we were in Davos together. You were on the stage, Paul Pullman was on the stage, Arianna Huffington was on the stage, and others, because clearly you didn't think that most businesses got that. If they did, there would be no reason for us to hold an event and encourage businesses to act differently. Yeah. So what's the impediment? If that logic is so clear, that your hypothesis that you just laid out is it's just hard. So what is it that, if that's the clear path that everyone should be able to see, what prevents businesses from going there?
Well, I don't want to sound preachy about this because it really isn't. It's not a normative statement in the sense that I'm attempting to advocate that this is in some way a morally superior position, although I think you could argue that. But I also think in many ways we're looking in the wrong place, right? So we had a conversation before about family businesses. Often multi-generational family businesses are run on exactly these lines because they're all about sustainability in its broader sense and longevity. And that requires some trade-offs between the short and the long term. So it's not that this isn't happening in the world. It's just that we tend to always think about big companies. Mm-hmm. I also think that this is a little bit of what I hoped, and one of the things that I do wish I had more time. Had more time, because one of the things that I believe is that success speaks for itself. So if we can see businesses that act in this way become more successful, then ultimately the thing will sell itself. And at Business in the Community, we've got over 800 companies that are members here in the UK, and we've got some of the most successful companies in the world that are members of us. So we've got Google in there, we've got Fujitsu, we've got people like Accenture, Unilever, and all of these companies. So I just hope that ultimately this thing does sell itself. In any event, I often feel that the focus on short-term profitability, which is often used as, the shareholders want it and so on, I think often that's a bit of an excuse for not taking on the bigger challenge.
So I'm going to open this up after one more set of questions. And obviously you should be thinking about questions about leadership and responsibility, but Anthony also knows a tremendous amount about the financial service sector. And so I want to spend a few minutes at least talking about your observations about the financial service sector. And in particular, you gave a recent talk where you talked about the Uber moment for banking. So general comments about what you see going on in the sector, and what did you mean by the Uber moment?
I have a rather sort of apocalyptic view of the state of financial services, so I apologise for this in advance. And last week I gave a talk to some students at another institution, and they asked me a similar question. And at the end of it, they all looked a bit sad because I think they were thinking about careers in financial services. And so somebody put their hand and said, well, what do you think we should do? So feel free to ask that question in the Q&A, because I've got an answer for that. So if we look at the state of the financial services industry, we really have to think about what happened between the late 70s and 2008. And what you saw over that time period was a massive increase in the size of the financial services industry. You saw specialization inside businesses, but you also saw conglomeration as you had global universal banks develop. You saw regulation reduced, capital levels reduced, balance sheets balloon. A lot of this was fueled by technology which allowed the structuring of complex derivatives products. Then, of course, you had what always happens if you look at the history of the financial services industry. there's these moments of alchemy where people turn around and say, well, we can take all this bad risk over here and chop it up and magically turn it into good risk over here. It's wonderful. It's alchemy, right? And statistically, you're exactly right. But when you're three standard deviations away from the mean, it doesn't work. And suddenly what you thought was gold turns out to be just the same old bad risk that you had over here. And so what happened in the financial crisis was a lot of these mechanisms that had driven the growth of the industry were seen essentially to be false. And all banks, of course, are inherently unstable. I'm not a very good flyer, and I particularly dislike helicopters. And I was talking to somebody about this one time, and they said, well, you do know that a helicopter is fundamentally unstable, don't you? It made me feel a lot better. The point being, of course, that unless you have both rotors turning, the thing falls out of the air. Well, banks are a bit like helicopters, right? You've got to have the right level of capital and leverage, but also the right level of liquidity. That's why you have a central bank. Central bank's the lender of last resort. The idea being that in extremis, if liquidity dries up, the bank can go to the central bank. In 2008, there were a lot of problems around that. So post-2008, policymakers and regulators act, I think, very decisively and effectively to avert a global depression. And we were on the brink of a global depression. By pumping massive liquidity into the financial system, by lowering interest rates, by providing capital to the system, it allows us to avoid Armageddon. But what we've ended up now is with a series of banks around the world that have appropriate but much higher levels of capital, upon which it is very difficult to earn a return above the cost of equity. And if you look at the median ROE for most banks are reporting now, it's probably around the 7% range. And for most banks, cost of equity would be in the 10% range. And that system, that situation cannot persist, because ultimately the providers of capital are not earning the return that they seek. Now, the solution to this, of course, is either employ less capital, which is not permitted under the regulatory system, generate more revenue, which is very difficult to do in a low interest rate, low macroeconomic growth environment, or reduce cost. The good news for banks, of course, is that the solution to that problem has arrived at the same time that the problem arrived. It is possible to automate banks in a very profound way and take out a lot of cost. The analog that I often use is the motor industry in the 70s, where cars really weren't very good, but then robotics came along, and this allowed the provision of much higher quality, much more capable vehicles at, in real terms, lower cost. But it requires banks to be able to seize that opportunity. And it is very difficult for banks to do that because, firstly, they have 40 years of different generations of technology layered on top of each other. But also the people inside banks are used to working with those technologies and not the newer technologies. Now let's flip to the other side of the equation. Let's look at the fintech space. According to McKinsey, there are over 2,000 fintech startups in the world, and $25 billion of venture capital money has gone into the fintech sector in the last 5 years, a big chunk of which has gone in the last 18 months. So there's massive amounts of activity going on around fintech. But I really see sort of three eras of this fintech revolution, and I'll give you the sort of short version because otherwise we'll be here all night. But in version one, you get this massive wave of capital and talent going into fintech, businesses popping up all over the place. Some of them are good, a lot of them aren't. Mostly they're focusing on places that are less focused on by the banking sector. They have some technology in them, but not a huge amount of technology. In the second wave of this, I think you see a shakeout where some of these models begin to break through. I think some lending models will break through. I think foreign exchange. I think some payments models, particularly around mobile commerce. those types of areas, you'll see some fintech businesses starting to gain critical mass and scale, which will, again, cause more problems for the incumbents who are already under pressure. But in the third wave of this, then things become very interesting, because technologies like blockchain allow you to completely retool the banking industry. So in today's world, if I want to pay you money, I have to pay it via my bank, via a central clearing counterparty, to your bank, who will then pay it to you. In a distributed world, it's simply the movement out of the ledger of the money from my ownership to your ownership. In other words, it's possible to build an entirely distributed and much more effective banking system, which I think will be quite profound. Now, the reason why I called it Uber Moments was because if you go back to 2009, Uber didn't exist, and now they're in 400 cities around the world, and they're able to transform the experience. Are they in Oxford? I don't know if Uber.
No,
no?
not yet.
Okay, I'm sure they'll be coming soon. But I guess many of you have used Uber. And the reason why Uber works so brilliantly is because it truly is a transformational experience for the user. I use Uber all the time in London. And I expect that there will be some of these breakthroughs in the existing, in these fintech startups. For the incumbents, I think it's pretty bleak. I don't really see any other choice but than there be a huge shrinkage of the numbers of people employed within the traditional banking sector, and I've estimated that to be anywhere between 20 and 50% over the next decade. And if you think that sounds a bit extreme, well, branch usage in the UK in 2014 was down 5%. So if you just run that out linearly, you're not far wrong there. And just in case you were thinking about going into the higher end investment banking world, when I was in Silicon Valley in October, I saw this small startup which is using artificial intelligence and natural language to eliminate just the sort of jobs that you would take as an entry-level person in an investment bank. In other words, basic level analytics. And you can ask questions in natural language, and the computer will write you a report in natural language. And this will include things like analyzing earnings statements from companies, listening to company conference calls, and those sort of things. So these changes are rather profound in my view. And probably, I know you want to get to Q&A, probably one last thought, which is something, again, which I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. As I look across various sectors of the economy, there is this massive wave of technology transformation coming. And as far as I can see, it is a net destroyer of jobs. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a Luddite. I love technology, and I think it is unstoppable. But if you think about driverless vehicles, we're probably less than 10 years away from having the ability to have autonomously driven vehicles. There are 3 million people in the United States who drive vehicles for a living. So just think about that. Think about what we said about financial services. Think about the accounting industry. I was with the president of one of the big professional bodies in the accounting profession yesterday. And they're very worried about the elimination of, again, the bottom of the pyramid in the accounting industry, in part because it reduces a lot of jobs, but also that was how you earned your experience. That's how you progressed in professions, and the same in the legal profession. In America now, all discovery, and as you know, the American legal system has massive class actions, all discovery is done electronically. There used to be armies of paralegals sitting in high school gyms going through documents. When they back-tested the technology against the people, the technology won out and it was much cheaper. So now when you go to court in America, the debate is about which technology you use to do discovery, not whether you use technology or people. So all of these verticals are under threat. And I really worry about where the jobs are going to come from in 20 and 30 years. But the good news about this problem is we know it's coming. But this time, unlike climate change, it would be nice if we actually did something about it. And so, for me, this is a fundamental question for the educational system, because we need to skill people now, and not just people like yourselves, but people who are in primary and secondary education, to be able to be economically active in this new world, and not just to sort of default to the jobs that are just not worth automating because they're too complex, but those jobs tend to be kind of minimum wage type jobs. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, there'll be almost limitless demand for high-skilled people in software engineering, physics, biotech, and all of that. So we need, I think, to shape our future by acting on this problem sooner rather than later.
That's a great and complete answer, and I'll put an advertisement. That's why we're going to be looking at the future of work as the next big topic that we look at as a school. We're going to go to questions now. There's some folks in a remote room, and I know that you weren't able to get in here. If you could have somebody in that room collect your comments, just write down your questions in paper and bring it in here. I'll make sure your questions get asked, and that way you get the benefit of that. For the folks in this room, this is your chance to ask Antony questions. If you might just, we'll have a mic to go around. If you can introduce yourself and then ask your question. Try to make the question brief so that we can hear the question with this, as opposed to, your position. Okay, so let's get started. Maybe over here first. Can you wait for the mic? Sorry.
Good evening. Thanks very much. Working, yeah. So thanks very much for the wonderful briefings on the leadership and the financial sector. And I'm a student from South Korea. And yeah, basically in South Korea, since the Asian bank crisis, since 1997, the way my country's banks have managed to stay liquid was cutting on the headcount of their employees or cutting on their wages. And now the problem is that's why the bankers in Korea have really long working hours almost every day. And I was wondering if such cases are evident in UK banks as well, or is it not? Is it because you already have a powerful central banks at the backbone of the country? Yeah.
I think the response that you've articulated in terms of the need to manage costs and become more effective is something that you see across the whole banking sector post the 2008 crisis. So you only have to open the paper almost every day. There's thousands, often tens of thousands of job losses across the industry. But the work still needs to get done. And this is where I think the application of technology is really important, because if you can create that point of automation, then of course you can permanently streamline or eliminate the work that's going on. And you can actually provide much better jobs for the people that remain in the organization, even though there'll be many fewer of them. So I think it is an opportunity that banks can choose to seize if they want to going forward.
Okay, maybe right there. Second in.
Hi, my name is Patrick, and I'm a current MBA student. And just last week, I sat down and talked with the chairman of Prudential PLC, referencing the EU referendum and the possible vote coming up in the UK. And he seemed to be very on the side that the UK needs to stay in the EU, which was very good for their business. And I was just wondering, with your background, if you could offer some possible insight with London being a world financial center and the possible ramifications that could come about if, for some reason, the UK decides to leave the EU as a whole.
I think most people looking at the economic arguments would, on balance, agree that the UK should remain within the EU. I think this is not basically an economic debate, it's a political debate. And I think it's hard to call right now how that political debate will ultimately end. I'm pretty certain that should the decision be to leave, it would be a very volatile and kind of bumpy period of transition. And it would probably take a number of years for that transition to be accomplished. But London has been a financial centre, for hundreds of years. and I think would likely remain a financial centre, possibly slightly diminished. But I still think that would be a viable financial centre. On the other hand, I think the economic arguments for remaining in are pretty convincing.
Okay. In the back, please.
Thinking about what you were saying about...
Introduce yourself,
Hi,
please.
I'm Kara. I'm a student at Saïd right now. And I'm thinking a lot about what you were saying as far as change, because I think there's so much talk about change. It's important, we value it, and the reality is that actually changing things is very frightening to most people and organizations. And so I'm curious who you think are the people or the bigger entities that would actually begin to shift the conversation around why culture and leadership is critical within organizations.
Yes. Firstly, I believe that we're in a world in which constant and rapid change is an absolute requirement. And we were talking before about the number of companies that have sort of been and gone in our living memory. So, Nokia, a company which dominated the mobile phone market and actually had the dominant share of the smartphone market in 2007, lost it completely to Apple. Kodak, a company that invented digital photography, lost it firstly to Sony and then to the mobile phone handset manufacturers. Look what's happening at Yahoo, a company that's going out of business before our very eyes. And so these are businesses which, they're not sort of 100-year businesses that have gone out. They're businesses that were dominant in their categories in a relatively short time period and have lost that dominance. And the reason why they lost that dominance was because they failed to understand there was a fundamental shift in the context in which they were operating. And so this is where I think strategy as a discipline is almost kind of outdated now. What really has to happen is the understanding of context and how that context might change. Not because you have to, because you can predict it, because you don't have a crystal ball, but because you can understand the likely vectors of change in context and therefore the best possible response to those potential changes. And it's exactly like we were talking about in the banking industry. The context has fundamentally changed. So playing the same game a bit better just isn't going to work. You have to fundamentally retool the industry. But your point about change is very, very important. Because in reality, as human beings, we're programmed not to change. Ask anybody who's tried to lose weight, stop smoking, drink less alcohol. These things in our personal lives are hard enough to achieve, let alone in a big, complex organization. And this is why I believe understanding the individual's motivation is so critical. Because until we can unlock people's appetite for change, we're not going to have the sort of velocity of change that we need. And this is really about overcoming fear. And by the way, in my experience, the more senior people become in the organization, the more change resistant they become. Because they've had that much of their career and they've been incredibly successful and worked very hard to get to this level in the organization. And they've got that much of their career in front of them. And they're saying, well, I was really successful doing that. So do I really want to do something different in that period? Maybe not. But unlocking that is really how we're going to be able to create the sort of dynamic organizations that can respond to massive change in context. And that's why I think understanding this on a very personal level becomes incredibly important. It feels more comfortable to keep doing what we did before a little bit better. It feels less risky, but actually in dynamically shifting context, it's super risky to stay doing what you were doing a little bit better. It's less risky to change, however uncomfortable that might feel. But the human dynamics of this are really important and need to be understood, I think, much better and managed much better inside large organizations. But again, it's very hard for senior people in organizations to admit at the end of the day they're scared. And you see this in technology. So a friend of mine runs a large industrial company, and he had a big deal with a client, and that deal required a certain amount of technology development to their existing systems. And this technology development was late, over budget, and was putting the deal with the client at risk and the relationship with the client at risk. So they went to find 2 consultants, super smart. They built the thing in open source software in about 30 days for 1/10 of the price they were being charged for the existing software provider. So my friend now, who is obviously more imaginative, is now saying, that's great, I want that across my whole organization. It's faster and 1/10 of the cost. And his own organization is saying to him, hang on a second, this feels a bit risky. We don't really understand this. We don't like this. We like doing it the old way, even though it's not as good, even though empirically they know that the new way is better. So overcoming these very human dynamics, I think, is critical to creating the sort of flexible, nimble organizations that can respond to these very rapid changes in context. And it's something that needs to be explored a lot more, and it's the sort of stuff that is uncomfortable to talk about.
Thank you, Anthony. In the back over there.
Hi, my name is Pranav, and I'm a student from US, just on a semester program over here. I have a follow-up question on what you were saying. I was just wondering, are we delaying on all the new technological inventions which are happening because of those managers or the top leaders who are sitting at the top and making really important decisions? Like when you were talking about automations, I think we do have the technology, but it's just that the focus is not towards those things. A lot of people are not getting the news. It's not on the headlines. And that's why I think that it should be pushed more because we can like save a lot of resources and do a lot more things with the technology invention and those things.
No, I agree with you. But if you look at where all the innovation's happening, it's generally not happening in large companies. So if you look at all the work that's being done in the automotive industry around electric vehicles and self-driving vehicles, it's being done in organizations like Tesla. It's not being done in General Motors. Now they're scurrying to catch up. Or look at the pharma industry, where a lot of the R&D in pharma is done in small startups, and that R&D is then bought as IP by big pharma companies. And part of this is because I believe that the structure and process of large organizations is still caught in the late 19th century, early 20th century model of operation, which is I define my strategy over some extended period of time, and I then build my organization like a big machine to deliver that strategic outcome. But of course, that just doesn't work anymore, because by the time you've defined your strategy, the context has shifted. And by the time you've built the first part of the machine, it's shifted again. In technology, how many people here have a technology background of some sort? So if you've spent any time in technology, you'll know that the classic development methodology was something called waterfall. Now, waterfall is a situation in which somebody in a business has an idea, they write it down, then somebody writes business requirements, then somebody writes systems requirements, then somebody goes writes some code, and then they test the components of the code, and then they do integration. Am I getting this right roughly? And they do integration testing, then they do regression testing, and then 18 months later, they launch the new product or service and find that it doesn't work. Because about 9 months in, we forgot to go ask the lawyers how the thing should work. Or we forgot to ask the marketeers how they were going to sell the thing. So now people develop using something called Agile, which is where everybody sits around the table, product people, lawyers, compliance people, whatever, the tech people, and we co-create. And we develop little bits of code, and then we drop them out there and we see if they work, And then when the customer feedback comes back and they hate it, we can quickly adjust. And that's really the model for how organizations need to work. This collaboration and co-creation is incredibly important. And if you go and look at startups in Silicon Valley, for example, or to some extent in London, in the tech work that's going on there, or I'm no doubt here in Oxford or in other university cities, that sort of co-collaboration is how people are working. But it's the only way that you can be responsive enough to the context changes. So I fear that the design of the corporation is getting in the way of this stuff, right? And we're going to see that manifest itself in, I think, rather poor returns on capital that's deployed into those sort of structures.
Great. Right up here in front.
Thanks very much. I'm a current student here in the MBA program, and I just want to put this in the context of what you see as the future of financial services, especially regarding Africa. As somebody who is aspiring leader in Africa, I'm a little bit concerned about how much money or the capital that foreign companies are actually putting into Africa, and at the same time, mostly in financial services, because that has always been a little bit safer compared to other sectors. And based on what you've just said about the future of this, and in the context of regulatory requirements, the Dodd-Frank, Volcker rule, and here in Europe, EMIR requirements, where do you think Africa is going to go with that? And two, the amount of capital that they're sending into Africa, are they getting it right? Or if not, why Africa?
That's a sort of seminar in itself, I think. I've spent a lot of time in Africa in the last decade, and I am still an optimist on the long-term prospects for Africa, even though clearly the sort of end of the commodity super cycle has been very painful for the economies in Africa, particularly those that are heavily dependent on commodities. I think it's true to say that there has been a lot of inbound investment into Africa, not all of it in financial services. I mean, companies like Unilever are very big there, Coca-Cola, GE, these sort of organizations outside of the financial services sector. But I also think there is an opportunity in Africa to sort of leapfrog to the next generation of financial services products. And you see this in things like payments and microfinancing. So in Kenya, where M-Pesa has really built a whole kind of financial system on top of the telephony system. And those sorts of things are quite encouraging, because where you have a functioning financial system, of course, you have higher levels of economic growth. And so the deployment of technology in Africa around financial services, I think, is very encouraging and optimistic. And I have to say, the amazing thing about Africa is you can go, and I remember doing this in Botswana, going about 100 kilometers outside Gaborone, and we were visiting this project that we'd sponsored with Habitat for Humanity. And I've been to a lot of poor places in the world, but this place was literally the poorest place I'd ever been. You get out of the vehicle and you look at your mobile, and there's 5 bars on your phone. It's sort of a very stark contrast between these things. So, as we're seeing with things like power generation, the distribution of financial services using technology, I think, is going to be a positive for Africa. I think in the short term, though, it's going to be quite bumpy out there.
Okay, 1 or 2 more questions. Actually, Catherine, if I can get one from the other room.
One from the other room, the mystery room. They'll be uninhibited by me actually being in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is from Dimitar, student who's sitting next door, and he asks, Antony, what was your biggest mistake in your career?
Yeah. There's so many to pick from. I suppose there's really 2 things that I would identify. One we've talked about quite extensively, which is this notion of thinking about change, leadership, culture, not as a kind of macro level activity, but additionally as a kind of micro level activity, as a sort of universe of one type engagement. And of course, doing that at scale is always challenging. And I think that's one of the key learnings that I took away from my experience. But the other thing that I feel, when you look back on it and you say, what else should I have done? I was in the industry in the 30 years in which it lost its way. And I'm on record as saying that I thought that banks, including Barclays, had become too short-term focused, too aggressive, and too self-serving. And so you always ask yourself, in that slide away from what really matters about the financial service industry, should I have been more vocal, acted more quickly in advocating for repositioning of the system? And it's always a dilemma because, do you sort of take the wins that you can get and try and change the system from within, or do you say, this isn't fundamentally broken and I'm not going to participate? So that's some of the questions that I ask myself about those types of things. And there are more specific. I talked to earlier on about a situation where I wasn't leading the business in the right way. But some of the mistakes are, a friend of mine used to say, you can make mistakes, just don't make the same one twice. And human beings, we do make mistakes, and often we learn the most from our mistakes. And I think the important thing is to reflect upon them and to figure out what you would do differently next time.
Maybe take one more, actually two more. You've been waiting a long time, so you next, and then the last question will go back there. We should take the lady up here as well. She helped me out on my technology monologue. She worked at Lehman, so I think she has a specific question for you. So we'll do three more, please.
Thank you. Jason, I'm a current MBA student here. Going back to 2012 and making that transition to Group CEO, obviously a very volatile time in the business. I'm just wondering if you could talk to maybe a couple of other experiences or challenges that you hadn't foreseen in maybe away from the actual volatility, but in becoming a CEO of the group.
I was asked by a very large consultancy firm to talk to a bunch of marketing directors that they had on there. They were running a program for them. And they wanted me to talk about marketing, how it's changing, but they also asked me to talk about what it was like to become the chief executive, because some of them aspired to be chief executives. I think there were 20 people in the room, and as a result of that talk, 2 of them decided they didn't want to be. So I'll issue that health warning before I say. So when you become chief executive, the thing you realize is that every problem that lands on your desk is a problem that can't be solved lower down the organization, because all the easy problems are solved, right? So you spend your days solving very difficult problems. I happen to quite enjoy that, but it's a different order of magnitude of problem. The second thing is you suddenly become incredibly popular. People that you never even thought of want to talk to you. And you get invited to all these cool things, and people listen to what you have to say. And you think, well, that's weird, because I feel the same as I did like 3 months ago, but now suddenly I'm this sage on all of these topics. And there are important things about that. One is don't mistake the office for you as a person. Don't let that go to your head. Also, manage your time, because time is incredibly precious. And so in my old job, I used to plan the whole year out in the September preceding the start of the year. That was all the meetings that I had to do, all the trips I had to do, when I was going to take vacation, that you had to do that, otherwise you lost control of your diary. And the third thing is the level of media scrutiny, which is particularly painful in this country. But everything you do is subject to media scrutiny. and so is your family. So, you know, when my daughter got engaged, the Daily Mail ran a diary piece about it. When I became CEO, we had journalists going around our neighbours asking, you know, do the children have a drugs problem? You know, it's just unpleasant stuff like that that's just part of the job, right? So I'd say those three things are what struck me. One is you have to deal with all the difficult problems. That's fine because I like doing that. Secondarily, don't let it go to your head. And keep your feet on the ground and make sure you have people around you who keep your feet on the ground. And actually that's really important because when you're not CEO anymore, the people who tend to keep your feet on the ground are the people who will still be your friends afterwards. And finally, you have to learn how to deal with the media because it's just goes with the territory. So if I put you off, I apologize, but that's just how it is.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask you the question. Considering UN is having gender diversity and equality for that matter as one of their sustainability goals this year and 15 years down the line, what do you think the financial services sector is doing for that and how it is going to improve?
So I'm a massive believer in and advocate for diversity. Again, I think it's the ethically right thing to do, but I also believe that diverse businesses perform better and all the data supports that. Financial services is mixed. So in some areas, you'll see a much greater gender diversity, particularly in senior management ranks. So areas like retail banking and credit cards. Areas like investment banking have traditionally been much more male-dominated. I think there is variable levels of commitment to building diversity in the financial services industry. I suspect that's true of other industries as well. But there are a number of people, a number of organizations that are deeply committed to it. And you know, at Barclays, we were one of them, and we committed to all types of diversity, not just gender, but sexual orientation, religion, race, all of those things. To be able to create a more effective organization. So I think there's still, in all honesty, a lot of work to be done. In this country, boards of public companies have become more diverse, but there's still a lack of women, in my view, in senior executive positions, and that really has to be addressed. What you do about that is it's a long conversation, but I think it has to do with creating more flexibility in the workplace for both men and women. And I think until we have that flexibility and it becomes acceptable for people to use that flexibility, we'll continue to struggle with this issue.
Thank you. And the last question was right there.
Hi. Thanks so much for being here. Nick Antstead, the current MBA student. There's been some fringe conversations around the business school here about the idea of followership, when to lead and when to know how to follow. And so the question I have is, how do you maybe think about this idea of responsible followership, not dutiful or blind followership or playing with LIBOR rates because everyone else is doing it, but how do you be within an organization and follow responsibly?
It's a very nuanced topic, but in many ways I think that there's no... Perhaps the distinction between followership and leadership is artificial in the sense that to follow a course of action is also a form of leadership, as is not following a course of action. And so knowing when to apply that is really an important thing. And a lot of it is going to be instinctive. And I don't think we should, this is a business school, right? So everybody's taught to be very rational and analytical, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm like that myself. But instinct is often, in these situations, a very good guide. And if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. So you need to explore that and unpack that and seek counsel around that to determine what the best course of action is. Sometimes the best course of action is to raise your concerns and have them be listened to. Sometimes the best course of action is to raise your concerns to somebody outside the chain of command. And of course, in extreme situations, it may be not to participate in the activity at all. And it depends on the circumstances as to which of those course of actions will be most appropriate. But the other thing is that leaders have the right to expect that people within their organizations and teams follow them, or if they have issues with that those issues are raised and aired. And I think the worst thing that you can do is just sort of be passive-aggressive about this. So the responsibilities upon what you've described as a follower, I think, are pretty clear and are also going to be informed both by reason and by instinct.
So to wrap up, what do we hope for you all? Well, I hope that you are thoughtful, intelligent Oxonians. I hope that you're reflective. I hope that you are leaders, and I hope that you're responsible. And one of the things that Antony said along the way was how you taught that was by having role models. And I hope that this past hour has given you a role model. And I think the last thing, one of the things you said is, don't confuse the role with the person. Antony, you're here because of the person and not because of the role. And we're all very grateful to come back to our community to share your thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.